Welcome to the Crimson Engine. My name is Rubidium. Today we are looking at this little camera, the C70, and my first impressions of having it for a week and shooting with it. The C70 marks a pretty interesting departure for Canon from their full-size cinema cameras that they've been putting out for almost 10 years now. Instead of the large blocky bodies, we have this stripped down DSLR style form factor that is much closer to the 1DX Mark III than it is to the C200 or C100. That said, it has all the bells and whistles of the cinema cameras with built-in ND, XLR, even though they're mini, a full suite of exposure tools, including waveforms, false color. While it lacks SDI out, it does have an SDI port for timecode in. So you can sync it to larger cameras and do dual system audio. The reason that I have it rigged like this with a small HD 4-inch monitor on the top is that while the screen that comes with the camera is good, it isn't great. It isn't bright enough for using outdoors with no reflection or no hood. It isn't large enough to judge critical focus from, and it's sort of in an awkward position, being off to the side of the camera. It's a personal preference of mine that I really like. When the monitor is in line with the sensor of the camera body, it gives me a much better feel to operate the camera with and a much better judge of my image. You can flip it around so that you can see it while you're shooting, and you can even fold it back in so that it's in line with the sensor, but at this configuration you can't rotate it or flip it. There aren't many cages available for the C70 right now, even though quite a few people are working on them. This is probably because it doesn't really need a cage. It's not designed to be a built-out camera. The C200 or C200B for basically the same price does a much better job at being a fully rigged, studio-ready cinema camera. The C70 is really designed to be a B or C camera, to be rigged to a gimbal or to be a backup for another larger camera if you're shooting in the studio, or to be a remote shooting camera when you're going off-grid, if you're going shooting documentaries, you're shooting run and gun. It's meant to be an all-enclosed, fully featured mini cam that you can get out of the studio with without having to bring all the batteries and screens and focus accessories. And in that, it really, really succeeds. The ergonomics are a little bit odd. Without this base plate on, it constantly falls forward onto its lens, and all the weight is on this side of the camera. So if you're holding it by its handle on this end that you're on the right-hand side, it constantly wants to fall downwards. You have to constantly exert pressure to keep it level. The image that comes off this camera is absolutely phenomenal. It is as good as the Canon C300 Mark III with its dual gain output, 12 plus stops of dynamic range, all very effectively compressed onto a 10-bit 422 XFAVC file that's recorded to V90 SD cards, of which there are 2 slots. Even though this means that in 3 cameras, I now have 3 different types of media, from the C200's CFast 2.0 to the C300 and C500 Mark II's CF Express, and now to the V90 SD card on the C70. But I guess it's a small price to pay for a very small form factor and dual card slots. Autofocus on this camera is excellent, just as it is with its big brothers, and the RF mount allows you to put on the Canon Speed Booster, which turns the Super 35mm sensor into a full-frame field of view. One slightly odd quirk that the camera has is it reinterprets the Speed Booster lens data for a Super 35 sensor. So if you're on a 35mm lens like this Sigma Art, it will tell you that you're on a 24mm lens. It's basically recalculating the millimeters of the lens for the Super 35 sensor. But this can be confusing if you're using this as a B camera for C500 and you put 35mm lenses on both of them. You'll get the same field of view, you'll get the same bokeh, but one camera will be telling you that you shot this on a 35, and the C70 will be telling you shot this on a 24. It does the same with the T-stop. If you have the lens set to T1.5, it will tell you that the lens is set to a T1. This is because of the added exposure that the Speed Booster gives you. And this has led to a lot of confusing comparisons on the internet of deeper depth of field at the same f-stop. It's actually the same depth of field on the lens t-stop, but the camera is displaying it as a higher t-stop, and so If you compensate for that and put it on a lower t-stop, you will get less depth of field, but the same exposure. You need to compensate with the ND or with the ISO, some other function of the camera if you're going to compare them side by side. Like every Canon camera, it has its quirks. The HDMI does not carry false color, which is a pity because it's one of my favorite exposure techniques on the C300 Mark III. I did, however, manage to set the false color, the custom false color on the small HD monitor to match the one in the camera. And now I can switch between false color, a LUT, and log just with a swiping on the screen rather than having to touch the camera and actually touch any buttons, which is good because it's hard to do while you're shooting since the buttons are sort of located down next to the lens. This thing is an absolute beast on a gimbal. I have the genuine Crane S2 and it takes less than 30 seconds to balance. Even with the big cine lens, it sort of flies around no problem at all. The added inbuilt sensor stabilization, digital sensor stabilization that carries over from the C300 Mark III onto this camera gives it really beautiful footage. I am by no means an expert with the gimbal, but I managed to get the smoothest, probably the smoothest footage I've ever shot with this camera with digital stabilization turned on. So a lot of people are comparing this camera to the Red Komodo, which came out around the same time, is a similar price, but I have to say they are vastly different cameras, products of totally different design philosophies and totally different companies, meant for different people. If you're an entry-level shooter, the C70 will really serve you well. It boots up automatically. It has built-in ND. The C-Log 2 has, as much latitude as if you can ever want. And the learning curve for these Canon cameras is pretty easy. I'm working on a C70 masterclass that'll be at canonmasterclass.com in the next couple of weeks. The Komodo, on the other hand, is really just a red sensor, 2 battery ports, and a card slot. It doesn't have a usable screen. You need to add a cage, you need to add a handle, you'll need to add probably rails. There is a very steep learning curve as far as dealing with Red's RAW in post. All in all, I think they're just for very different needs. The Komodo is perfect if you're an experienced cinematographer looking to get into the Red ecosystem and use it as some kind of fully rigged studio camera. The C70, on the other hand, is perfect if you're graduating from the Canon DSLRs or another brand's DSLRs into a proper cinema camera with all those inbuilt tools already at your fingertips. Both great cameras in what they're designed for, but for a totally different type of use, totally different type of cinematographer, and a totally different price point. The C70 is only $5,500 and comes with almost everything you need to shoot but one card. The Komodo, on the other hand, you'll be putting in at least twice that much before you start shooting with it. Those are my first impressions of the Canon C70. If you like the look of some of the footage I shot with this, you can check out the lookup tables that I graded with and my new DaVinci Resolve course on canonmasterclass.com in the links below. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.